Coming up next on the Breadwinning Mums.
Care less about what other people think, and by extension, do not compare yourself so much with other people. A lot of it, I think, does come as a function of learning the hard way. And I think it is up to people to actually take that, do something with it and to learn it themselves. So I'd give the younger Ben the advice, avoid comparison, don't care what other people think. Whether younger Ben would accept or be in a position to listen to that advice is probably a whole other question.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Breadwinning Mums podcast. This is a place where we debunk the myths of working mums, cheer each other on, and show the world that you can be a mum and still pursue excellence in your chosen area of expertise. It is my pleasure to end this season's episodes with a conversation with my good friend, Ben Pronk. Ben is the managing partner of Mettle Global, one of the co-founders of the Resilience Shield, the co-host of the Unforgiving 60 podcast, and an adjunct faculty at the University of New South Wales. We discussed all things about life, how to build resilience, and the topic of his upcoming book, How to Find Happiness, not despite, but with the full knowledge that we're all going to die in the end. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation with Ben Pronk. Ben Pronk, welcome to the Breadwinning Mums podcast.
Jane, thank you for having me. Thank you for having me back.
Exactly.
Feel very honoured that I didn't blow it so badly first time that you'd consider inviting me back. It's great to be here.
I've had a couple of full circle moments over the past couple of years, but this is easily one of my favorite full circle moments. So for those listening who don't know, I basically asked you how you started your podcast when we met about 3 years ago. You have your own podcast, The Unforgiving 60.
Yeah. And in fact, we still say it's a going entity. We haven't recorded for a little while, but absolutely intend to get back to it. But you're certainly more prolific than us these days.
Well, it sounds like The Unforgiving 60 is becoming The Forgiving 60.
That's touche. Yes. Yeah.
No, but thank you. You basically provided the blueprint on how I could start a podcast, and here we are, a couple of years later.
That is awesome, and it's been really cool seeing that progression, and obviously your own book coming out in the meantime, and even circling around with Tim in his latest book. There's wonderful little connections and a nice little web of goodness.
Yeah, amazing. So Ben, you're a man of many accomplishments, not just professionally, but also personally and academically. But before we go into all of that, I'm just going to start with a very basic question. Mm-hmm. Who are you as a human, Ben?
I think that while it's a simple question, it's a very difficult question. And I actually would answer that I don't know. And I answer that quite deliberately in light of what we're going to talk about today, because I think, without trying to sound too philosophical, that finding the answer to that question is pretty close to what I find real happiness in. And so, who are you? The closest I could come is a work in progress. But I think I sort of answer that very vaguely, but deliberately so, because it does tap into a couple of these really important things that I hope we talk about today as we talk about this concept of happiness.
Awesome. I really like to start all interviews with this question because it tells you what a person values the most. Some people say I'm a role.
Some
Yeah.
person would say, I'm a mum or a dad. And I guess what you value at the moment is that philosophical and continual evolution of who you are as a person, not just embedded in one role or one area of life, but a continuous formation of one.
That's a really, I thought I was just being evasive and indecisive in my answer, but it is close to what you've just said. I don't know that there's any single focus. And I think this has changed a lot. And this is something that I do or have been reflecting on a bit and certainly talk about in this book. But if you'd asked me that 15 years ago, the answer would have been I'm a soldier. Like, this identity. Uh, I guess role identity fusion, if you like, that was very much what my whole sort of raison d'etre was. It was a real kind of singular purpose in my life. I don't think that's any longer the case. I'm not convinced it was entirely healthy to have that sort of thing, but it's appropriate for a lot of people, and a lot of people do find, particularly people in high performance roles, that you have to be all in on that thing, and that's okay. But I don't think it's sustainable. And I think from a resilience and a happiness point of view, which are two areas that I find really interesting, it's probably not entirely healthy over the long term. So I increasingly, the less I can answer that question, who am I? Arguably, that the happier I am in many ways.
Interesting. I'd like to take us to the young Ben. What was he like?
He was a chubby little fella. I say that a lot because like I wasn't obese. I could walk upstairs and stuff, right? But I wasn't a sporty guy. I wasn't the person in the first 15 football or the first 11 cricket. And I'm sure if this were a psychiatrist's couch and not a podcast, we could explore how that shaped some of the ways I've approached life. But the point that I think is important is that I was not the person most likely to, I don't know, get into special forces or to end up enjoying distance running or to do these sorts of things. I was quite academically focused, although still not shooting the lights out there. Like I think I've always been lucky to have had the privilege of good education and parents sent me to a good school. And I feel lucky to have done pretty well in that respect. But I was certainly not very self-confident, and that took a long way to sort of get through. And again, those ideas of identity and sort of self-efficacy took a bit to develop. So yeah. Having said all that, please don't get this impression that I had this terrible kind of childhood. I had a very lucky upbringing and a very loving family. I'm still very close with my brother and my mum. My father passed away a couple of years ago, but yeah, it was a good upbringing. But yeah, I was certainly not a superstar in, I think, any facet as a kid. And sorry, that implies that I am now, doesn't it? I'm not now either. But yeah, it was not like this overall sort of amazing performance as a kid.
So, in summary, you suck as a kid, and now you suck as an adult. So,
Yeah, exactly. It's nothing has changed much. Yeah.
And that's the end of the podcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your attention. Yeah. No, yes.
So, jokes aside, you went on a 1 year sabbatical leave with your dad after you finished
Yeah.
high school around Australia.
Yep.
So, looking back as a dad now, how did that shape the way you perceive manhood?
It was massive for a whole bunch of reasons. So I finished school relatively young. So I was an army brat. My dad was in the army as well. We moved around a lot. And, as you chop and change between, particularly back then, the education systems, different states in Australia, there were all sorts of peculiarities. I ended up finishing high school. I just turned 17 as I finished high school. I'd already been accepted into the army, and both Dad and I sort of figured it's probably not a smart idea to do it at that age. Give yourself another year. The ability to drink alcohol legally featured in there as well. But so it was a year to sort of get some age. But it was also this amazing year in terms of time with Dad, who, as I said, has subsequently passed. But a really interesting that kind of transition as I'm in that period trying to find out my own identity as an adult, as a man, and recognizing his identity as a man, as distinct from my father, that he was this human who, was dealing with his own stuff and had his own shortcomings and strengths and all that sort of stuff. So it was really cool to see him for the first time in that environment as we were traveling together, a lot of trips throughout Australia and sort of, problem solving through broken down cars and all that sort of stuff. That transition from him as a father figure to a friend and another man, I think was useful. I've spoken and we wrote in the Resilience Shield about just how influential Dad was all throughout our upbringing, and particularly this idea of him instilling in us this sense that, everything is figure outerable. If people can become surgeons or pilots or scientists or, SAS operators or whatever, if that can be done by a human, then there's probably no real reason why you can't do that. And so this real idea that virtuosity is not some gift that's given to a select few, but is something that's attainable through hard work, dedication, and focus. This was something that Dad always instilled in us, and one of the greatest gifts he's left both my brother Dan and I with.
Yeah, I think that's very important, seeing in the crisis of masculinity, as Professor Scott Galloway called it. How has this, legacy, I guess, that you got from your dad influenced the way you raise your son?
Well, it is really interesting looking at that concept of masculinity. I dislike the term, but I get where it's coming from, this idea of toxic masculinity, and certainly some of this really what I consider a very scary backlash against some DEI initiatives that's getting championed out of the States, and a lot of very vocal sort of bro science and that sort of stuff. I absolutely think that masculinity is a thing. There's clearly a difference between masculinity and femininity, and I think that it is something that in many senses is something to be really proud of, this idea of being able to achieve things and to use whatever powers you might have physically or cognitively in a positive sense to help others, at the base level, potentially protect others. A real example that always stuck with me is that Dad was always into vintage cars. He'd always grown up fixing cars, and he liked cars, and that was a thing. And, that's a very blokey sort of trait, but he would never fail to stop for someone at the side of the road. And I've reflected on this a few times. It was not about this kind of skill that he had, and in that case, a stereotypically, probably anachronistically blokey sort of skill. It was not about just, making his car fast. It was about, this is something that I can help other people with. Now, that is not a purely male-born trait or attribute or any of that sort of stuff, but I think that's very much how Dad viewed this idea of masculinity, and by extension, this idea of things like military service. It is not about this hurting other people or sort of applying violence in that sort of negative sense, but it is about recognizing that sometimes these things are a necessary mechanism of government policy or whatever it might be, and using that kind of I guess, like I say, stereotypical kind of concept of masculinity in a positive sense.
So how did you distill that sense of agency, I guess, to your young son without all of the world of knowledge and wisdom?
Well, I think part of it was because I never saw myself as this traditional sort of, and again, I hate this term, but this idea of an alpha, that whatever that means, and I still don't really know what that means, and certainly don't see myself as that, but that kind of concept is the kind of apex of masculinity. I never saw myself fitting that mold, and yet I sort of still found that I was able to go into some of these roles that stereotypically would require those sort of higher masculine traits. And so my reflection on my own journey is that it's not about being the biggest silverback and beating everyone up and being tough and sort of over domineering in that sense, but it is about having self-efficacy and about developing yourself in a sense that you can sort of achieve a goal or help others. And this, I think, is something that I'm delighted to see in my son and his generation is actually coming through. I think as I see my kids and my business partner Tim, my good mate Tim's kids, who his son's a lot older than my son, but I get the strong impression they don't feel that they need to beat each other up in the classroom or be negative against other genders or sexualities or any of that sort of stuff in the same way that my generation did to demonstrate masculinity. So I'm delighted that societally this is changing, and I hope that through my own example that I'm setting that sort of example for Hudson, my son, and indeed Charlie, my daughter as well. Because again, probably reductionist views, but daughters marry people like their fathers, or they see those kind of role models as behavioural norms, and I think if that is a domineering, physically intimidating, psychologically intimidating version of masculinity, then that's not good for either gender to be brought up in that environment to emulate those behaviours.
Interesting. You've spent a good part of your life in the army. How was it?
I like the short answer is great. I got so much out of my military career. I feel so thankful to have had the opportunity. I feel so thankful to have been in the army at the time I was. It was this really operationally busy time. I look at my father's service, 30 odd years. He finished pilot's course just as the Vietnam War ended, and he got out basically just before Timor started, this real period of kind of low operational activity. So I was the opposite. I got in just as Timor kicked off, and then we had Afghanistan, Iraq, and Solomon Islands, and all these different sorts of things. So the Cliff Notes is really good. Interestingly, though, that evolution of the exposure of organisations to combat and the impacts that it has on individuals and cultures. It's clear that the unit I spent most of my career in, the SAS, obviously has been in the news for all sorts of bad reasons recently. The allegations of war crimes. It has been, and full disclosure, I've not been involved or under any allegation of war crimes, but certainly was part of that environment and part of that culture and part of that leadership structure under which these sorts of things happened. And it has been interesting, particularly as I've left the military, to reflect on the things that led up to that and just how abnormal and dehumanizing exposure to combat is, and particularly chronic and repeated exposure to combat is, and how easily these kind of things can happen if we're not so actively challenging our values, challenging our ethics, and not allowing what they call that normalization of deviance. These small ethical infringements that compound over time and become the new norm and create the preconditions for some of the things we've seen. So I think it was an incredible career. It set me up so beautifully as a human and in terms of the jobs I'm doing now. But it also gave me a really unique and I think valuable exposure to some of these really interesting and potentially very cautionary aspects of the human condition, particularly as it applies to, the application of violence and how quickly that can be normalized and that can be deviated.
Yeah, that's interesting. We see that as well in different industry, right? Like, for example, financial service industry, left unchecked, things can go wrong quite easily and quite quickly as well. And so in that scenario, what do you propose to be a practical antidote?
Yeah. Well, I kind of really I took a lot from, I know you and I both know Simon Longstaff, who does a lot of work with ethics in the University of New South Wales. He talks about these two big challenges to ethics. The first one being unthinking custom and practice. So this idea of just keeping on doing the same stuff that we've done before, not challenging the status quo. Or what's going on in many ways, that frog in boiling water type situation. And then the second one being hypocrisy, this disconnect between the things we espouse, which is often codified in things like organizational values or ethos or, compass or whatever it might be. We're saying all these nice things, but we're doing all these things that are not in conjunction with that. And so, I think it's a really good analogy you bring out. Like you look at the Royal Commission into Financial Services. When you look at some of these instances, similar to the war crimes, if you look at them just in isolation, well, I would never sell a mortgage to a dead person or someone who clearly can't, repay that financial instrument. That's completely unethical. That someone else would do that. But when you look at the environments and the pressures and the incentives and all that sort of stuff that's led up to that behavior, you can see it's not as black and white as it may look at the end. And so I think we want to be constantly challenging those things. Longstaff, Simon talks about constructive subversion. So having this environment where people can constantly challenge the status quo. Is this right? Is there a better way of doing that? Should we done that practice? It might have won that particular battle, or it might have resulted in that KPI or that financial outcome. But was that the right thing to do? Having an environment where we can have those discussions is really important. And this is entirely contingent on psychological safety. And we're doing a lot of work in this space. Obviously, there's been psychosocial hazards legislation brought in, so people are starting to take more attention to this. But to me, this isn't about a governance kind of box ticking thing. This is about creating a leadership environment where people can contribute different ideas, which is going to make our end state richer, but also can challenge those norms and can allow us not to have that scary kind of groupthink descent into these sorts of environments where we normalize behaviors like, selling inappropriate financial instruments or products to people who can't afford it, or in a military context, using sort of violence and lethal force in an inappropriate manner.
What happens if that psychological safety doesn't exist yet in the culture of the organization, and particularly if you're, in the bottom rank of the hierarchy? How could you make a difference in that regards?
It's really hard at the bottom ranks to make that difference, because what we've seen and what we certainly saw in elements of the inquiries into the SAS situation are people who enter that environment at those low ranks and all of a sudden get swept up along into some of these unethical behaviors that they haven't been normalized towards. They haven't been normalized to that level of deviance, and it is incredibly psychologically confronting and damaging for people who are involved at those bottom levels, and yet it can be very hard for them to speak up. And so a lot of it is organizationally and structurally. If we can have even things like whistleblower mechanisms can be effective, but it is, I think, really incumbent on the leaders to be able to drive that from their perspective and to be open to that kind of conversation and respectful challenge, respectful conflict to the way we're doing things from all levels. I think that is absolutely critical.
Interesting. I'd like to talk about the paradox of self-preservation and going out there to help the community or higher purpose. So during your time in the army, when you're about to go on another rotation, I'm sure you experience a paradox between not wanting to go to save your own life, save your family's lives, but also needing to go to save your mates' lives, quite literally. And I see this as well during my work through UNSW, where we work with NGOs and social organizations, where people are always sent to a very high pressure environment with low resources, not knowing what to do, but also nearing the end of burnout, but also they know that the work still needs to be performed. And as someone who has spent, a good 24 years in the army, you have successfully managed this paradox quite well. And so what tips would you give to, people who are working as first responders, public servants, or NGOs, workers who are experiencing this paradox?
Yeah, it's a good question. Interestingly, I personally, I never really experienced that paradox. I always wanted to go, and this is one of the really interesting things I think with military service is that initially anyway, the vast majority of people within uniform actually want to deploy. And I remember when these things first kicked off, we'd had this 30 years of peace, relatively speaking, and then East Timor kicks off, and people were almost literally knifing their mate to get on that trip, to go into that war zone, and then when Afghanistan, Iraq, and it started to get these really big shooting wars, people were champing at the bit to get in there. So there is this element of, I think, in a lot of industries, people obviously do want to do what it is they've trained for, and particularly if they've got that alignment in terms of it's a purpose that they believe in. This is something bigger than themselves, not just sort of making money or ticking a box. Then there's that sort of professional satisfaction in doing the thing you've trained for, but also that purpose. This is manifesting my sort of destiny or what I was supposed to do or where I find meaning, as a real driver. And that does actually serve as a motivating factor. It also serves as a psychologically insulating factor for a lot of that sort of stuff. I was also very lucky in that, so I as an officer posted in and out of the unit, and so didn't have that same chronic exposure. Some of the soldiers, so that makes up the backbone of a unit like the SAS regiment, that are just in that environment for literally decades. And over that period of campaigning, we're deploying 10, 11 or 12 times. And these are big 4, 5, 6 month rotations. You're talking about multiple back-to-back sort of versions of this over a 10 or 15 year period. So folk like that obviously had a much higher exposure. And so, there were obviously instances towards the end where that less and less motivation, particularly if you've had a few close calls or seen mates injured, all that sort of stuff, that can have an impact on sort of wanting to go across. But I think one of the really important things, regardless of the military or any other environment, is recognizing that stress does take its toll. And even though in any of these environments we can develop, there are inoculating effects from repetition. So, the more we do stuff, the less subjective stress we feel. First responder, for example, first time they go to, I don't know, a domestic violence situation or a road traffic accident, fatality, that's incredibly subjectively impactful. By the 10th or 12th time, they're kind of dealing with it a lot better. They've normalized it. But that stress still has a cumulative impact. A very famous book on the topic of post-traumatic stress disorder is called The Body Keeps the Score. And that is exactly what's happening. There are physiological impacts to that exposure to trauma, and they do tend to accumulate. And so my advice is to recognize that. The big parallels we try to draw when we're talking about mental health in a resilience context is try to sort of think of it analogous to a physical injury. If you start to get a bit of a hamstring strain, you're not going to continue doing sprint training. You are going to recognize that you have to back off, and, you pull that hamstring, you won't keep running on it. You will step out, you'll take that rest, you'll recover, you'll come back, hopefully in full strength, but maybe there'll still be limitations on how you can come back. Those kind of concepts are pretty well normalized in a physical sense, and yet in a mental health sense, we don't tend to think the same way. We tend to, keep running on that sprained hamstring and keep doubling down on those things until we can't walk at all, without flogging the analogy too much. So I think that understanding that just like physical strain can have an impact on our bodies, psychological strain and cumulative stress is going to have an impact on our mental health, and to recognize it in that respect, to look at proactive measures that we can do to help recover and to help to reduce the stress loads in our body, and then that requirement at times to step back and be kind on ourselves, to take a break from the exposure.
Yeah, amazing. Which is a huge area of the book that you co-wrote with Tim and your brother as well, Dr. Dan, The Resilient Shield. For those listening, I highly recommend The Resilient Shield for civilians and military people alike. But you're currently working on a book that you're going to publish next year. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of stems from the work we did on resilience. One of the aspects we looked at as a bit of a sense-making concept at the start of the Resilience Shield is this concept of happiness, which I found particularly interesting. You know, it obviously serves a facet within the resilience context. And I sort of came to this sort of thought as we did more and more work in the resilience space, that I think you absolutely need to be resilient to be happy. But just because you're resilient doesn't mean that you're going to be happy. I think, you know, you need resilience for happiness, but resilience in itself doesn't guarantee it. And so I got really interested in, well, let's expand on this. What actually is happiness? You know, how have we as humans looked at this throughout the centuries that we've been studying it or aware of it? And I really wanted to get a better understanding of what this concept was, the different perspectives that we can take on it, but just as we had done within the resilience domain, how can we get better at it? How can we actually increase this very individualized, very qualitative, very subjective sort of idea of happiness? And so that was the crux of the book, trying to work out, well, what is this thing? And based on that knowledge, how can we get better at it?
So once you've built resilience and once you've built the ability to be happy, would you say that you're a complete human then?
Yeah, I reckon something like that. And like a lot of this is so kind of subjective in terms of how you define these things. So I think there's absolutely some absolute, or there are definitely some absolutes we could apply to sort of resilience. Whereas I think happiness is probably a little bit more subjective. But the interesting thing is that I think a lot of us probably don't spend enough time defining what happiness means in our own lives, and are therefore caught up in what societally or what society often depicts as proxies for happiness. And these are things like status, money, success, you know, the kind of trappings of a good life, fame, and all that sort of stuff. And I think they're really poor proxies in a lot of cases. And I think if we don't actually sit down and decide what happiness means for us individually, then there's that tendency to get swept up along in pursuit of these things that ultimately are not going to actually make us happy.
Interesting. When I was 25, I went to live in London and traveled around Europe. And a colleague that I was working with gave me this book called Zen and the
Love
Art
it.
of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert
Yep.
Pinsik. Yep. It was my first introduction to philosophy. I grew up in Catholic church, went to Catholic school, etc., etc. So this was my first exposure to the Stoics, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And a big thesis of the whole book is about arete. And I loved it so much that I actually got a tat out of it.
Right. I didn't know that.
Unfortunately, the tattoo artist didn't know what arete meant, and I think he thought it was aret, which was basically conversation for a different time. But I'm so pleased to see that arete made a whole chapter in your new book. So can you tell us a little bit more about arete and how it manifested in your life?
Absolutely. So one of the first things I look at in the book is some of the philosophical approaches to this idea of happiness, because one way or another, we've been looking, as humans, been looking at this topic for about 2,500 years. And there's been some really interesting sort of developments in terms of what it means. Some of the really early takes on happiness, the pre-Socratic kind of thinkers, it was all basically about luck. And in their case, linked to the gods. And, you know, the whims of the gods decided whether you'd be happy or not. There was a big luck component to it. But as we started to get into some of the big thinkers in ancient Greece, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, we started to recognize that we might actually have a bit of agency in happiness. And this started to spawn some of the big schools of happiness thought that we know to this date. There's some real differences in terms of what mechanisms could lead to happiness according to these different schools. But some of the virtue-based schools, and Aristotle is probably the pinnacle of these. He traces his lineage. Basically, Socrates taught Plato, who taught Aristotle. So there's a strong lineage, but not absolute agreement in all of these. But Aristotle very much viewed this idea of happiness through a Greek word, which is eudaimonia. It doesn't translate well into English. Some people translate it directly as happiness. I think a better translation is flourishing or thriving. But it basically talks about the pursuit of this concept of excellence. And arete is the Greek word for excellence. And in many ways, the virtue-based schools are focused on achieving excellence. Per Aristotle, arete in a human concept is the achievement of eudaimonia, this achievement of a meaningful goal, the pursuit of excellence in these virtues. And generally, they center around virtues like temperance, courage, wisdom, and moderation. These are the sort of big virtues that the ancient Greeks championed, and certainly Stoicism has taken up. Interestingly, arete in the Greek thought could mean different things for different organisms and even inanimate objects. I mean, they would talk about arete for a knife being, a sharp edge and the ability to cut well. So that's the ultimate manifestation of its function. And arete for a racehorse would be to be able to go fast for long distances, the ultimate manifestation of its function. For humans, arete is the achievement of eudaimonia, this purpose-driven, challenge, flourishing sort of goal. And so that is absolutely fundamental to sort of Greek thought into Stoicism. I think it is a really good way to look at happiness. And clearly, Zen and the art, Phaedrus is constantly pursuing quality. This idea, what even is it? And there's some wonderful and quite dense discussion in that book of that same topic.
Yeah, interesting. Can I quote you on your upcoming book?
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure which part this was, but you said, I watch friends bleed onto the desert sand, injured under my command, and ultimately as a result of tactical decisions that I had made. None of those experiences were pleasant. Indeed, they were notable precisely for the complete absence of external goods, such as comforts and sensual pleasures. But I certainly consider myself to have been eudaimonic in each of them, filled with purpose and thankful to be given the opportunity to overcome difficult challenges on a path to what I considered my telos.
Yeah.
Could you share a little bit more about that? How could you feel eudaimonic when you see your mates bleeding on the desert sand?
Yeah. This was very much in that sort of reflection. And I mentioned there are a couple of these big schools of thought on what happiness might be. A counterpoint to those values-driven schools, like Aristotle's school and like the Stoic school, are the more pleasure-based schools. So originally the hedonists, later sort of taken up by the Epicureans. These kind of philosophies were focused on happiness being the experience of pleasure in the moment. And in many ways, that a happy life is one where you can string together all of these pleasurable sort of situations. So, what in a nutshell, it's like, if it feels good, do it. If it doesn't feel good, avoid it like the plague. These are kind of the crux of those pleasure-based schools. And while I don't think we should totally discount that. I think there absolutely is a place for pleasure for its own sake, and there's a place for being in the moment and enjoying pleasure-based activities. I also think that this can't, and in general, the big criticisms of those schools is that it's a pretty hollow existence, that just stringing together sensual pleasures is unlikely to be a fulfilling life for many people. And as we look at some of the modern neuroscience and psychology, there's also a law of diminishing returns. We tend to get adaptation. We tend to get used to these things. We need bigger doses to get the same sort of pleasure. Can lead to paths like addiction and sort of tolerance and that sort of stuff. So what I was trying to say in that particular passage is that there were periods of my life that weren't particularly pleasurable. It certainly was not pleasurable being involved in situations where my friends are hurt, particularly when I'm in charge of the show and ultimately I'm responsible for that. And that's a bit about, tactical decisions I've made, good, bad, or indifferent, have resulted in this situation. But even, the sort of prelims to that, other situations where, and probably more a day-to-day thing, getting up in the morning and going for a run is not always pleasurable. Studying on a Friday night while your friends are out partying is rarely pleasurable. Working on a difficult relationship and, struggling through those kind of things is rarely pleasurable. But this can be part, and I would argue needs to be part, of a eudaimonic life, that happiness generally comes, the real sustainable, meaningful happiness generally comes from working through difficulties like that, if it's in pursuit of something that you think has purpose and meaning. And so working on that relationship, building it to a point where you have got a strong relationship, working for that degree or that qualification or that promotion or that physical fitness or whatever it is, in the moment, they're not necessarily going to be pleasurable, but over time, to me, that is that thriving, flourishing struggle that's associated with a eudaimonic goal. And telos, that word you used, is a Greek word for sort of goal, this ultimate end state.
Yeah, awesome. I've had my own portion of eudaimonic telos, I guess.
Yep.
Type B fun. Not fun in the
Yeah.
moment, but it's
Yeah.
fun afterwards.
I really like that term. And you and I have shared our sort of love for endurance sports and all that sort of stuff. That to me is just this wonderful little microcosm for exactly what we're talking about. It often sucks. And the real thing that I find interesting is, while a lot of these things are focused on a goal, this idea of a telos, something meaningful you're working towards, the thing that's a real kicker for me is the goal is actually so immaterial.
Yep.
If you don't achieve it, it doesn't mean that things aren't lost. We've spoken about pulling out of races or having shockers or whatever. That doesn't mean it's for naught. In fact, often there's great learnings there. But the thing that I find really interesting is careful what you wish for. When you do achieve that goal, and often if that's how you are anchoring your definition of happiness, I'll be happy when, or I'll be happy if, I'll be happy when I get that promotion, or when I get that new car, or when I finish that marathon. If that's what you're anchoring it on, it's very unlikely that that in itself will bring you happiness. We are subject to this wonderful thing called adaptation, this psychological concept known as the hedonic treadmill, that if that's how we're judging our happiness, then the second we hit that goal, we may be happy for a little while, but there's always that next longer race or faster car or higher promotion or better house or whatever. And so we never get off that treadmill. So in many ways, this is that balance. It's that trick between having a goal and working towards a meaningful struggle, that eudaimonic pursuit towards that goal, but recognizing that goal in itself ain't going to bring you happiness. It is actually about it providing a framework for that struggle and that meaning and that joy you get on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, awesome. I really love the work of Adam Grant, and he was discussing especially this concept where he explored the pursuit of happiness is not actually the pursuit of happiness. It is the happiness of the pursuit that you actually go through.
So good. Yeah, I'd not heard him say that, but that's unsurprisingly a much more eloquent way of describing what I'm fumbling through.
Yeah, what Adam said. I want to go through the work of Albert Camus of absurdism
Yeah.
that you mentioned in your upcoming book. Can you talk a
Yeah.
little bit more about that?
Yeah, this was a bit of a sort of outlier. Like in as I looked at the big philosophies, clearly I looked at the big three, Socrates to Plato to Aristotle. I then looked at the influence of that into Stoicism and some of the Greek Stoics, Zeno, and then into Marcus Aurelius and Seneca and Epictetus, the Roman Stoics. I was really interested in the hedonists, Aristippus, the original Cyrenaic hedonist, and Epicurus, who had the eponymous school named after him, those kind of pleasure-based philosophies. I found all of those really fascinating and really big pillars. But one philosophical school that had always resonated, or that had resonated with me through big parts of my life, is the school of absurdism, which, as you said, championed and probably most associated with Albert Camus, a French novelist and philosopher in post-war France. It's, if you like, it's one of a number of schools of philosophy that believe that life has absolutely no meaning. So if you look at, say, Stoicism or Aristotelian thought, they're very much viewing that the purpose of life is this eudaimonia, this idea of pursuit of this meaningful goal, this telos, that there is a meaning behind all of this sort of stuff. And even though they recognize that life is not fair and different things can happen, there is still this meaning that we're pursuing. Well, these other philosophies, things like existentialism, nihilism, and absurdism, they view that there is no meaning to life. And they take different different sort of slants on this. Nihilism sort of is almost this, life has no meaning, so, fuck it, let's just give up. Existentialism's more like life has no meaning except the one we create ourselves. So this idea that there's no inherent meaning, so it's up to us to find that and to create it for ourselves. Absurdism, however, and this is the one that resonates with me and that I've included in the book, says that even if we do make up a meaning, then in essence, life is so meaningless and so absurd that even that meaning is going to lack meaning, that we're only sort of fooling ourselves. And so what it's basically saying is that we need to reconcile the fact that there is no meaning, that life is not supposed to make sense. And while that may sound ostensibly very depressing, it's actually quite liberating because it encourages us to not let that shape our perspective. It encourages us to still find enjoyment and find sort of activities that we can do that bring us a sense of fulfillment, even in recognition of the fact that ultimately life has no meaning. And for me, I talk about in the book that, for that first half of my life, I guess, and certainly my military career, I very much found this telos, this eudaimonic pursuit in my military service. And you asked before, who am I? Back then I would have answered, I'm a soldier. This is what it's all about. It was all very clear. It was all meaningful. It wasn't always pleasant, but it was all heading towards this thing that had meaning. With the benefit of age and probably circumstance, I look at just how meaningless all of that had been. I mean, you look at that particular case study of Afghanistan where we poured 20 years of blood and treasure into this country. All these lives changed, all this devastation wrought and this psychological damage on people and all that sort of stuff. And yet when we sort of finally completed that sort of shambolic route out of country, and the dust settled back on sort of Kandahar airfield, the situation was almost indistinguishable from where it had started 20 years ago. We've got the Taliban back in rule. We've got this situation where girls still can't go to school. It's this backward sort of place. All these sort of things that we thought we were trying to change. Essentially, it had all been for naught. And this was a real, I guess, reflection point for me that, these ideas, in the grand scheme of things, are pretty inconsequential. We dedicate so much of our lives towards these things that ultimately don't necessarily have meaning. And I actually find that quite liberating. I find that a lot of people and a lot of the kind of negative aspects that we see around the world are because people are pursuing what they believe is, right and the only right and the only way to sort of find meaning. And I think it is kind of liberating to recognize that ultimately none of it matters, that a lot of it is quite absurd. But that doesn't prevent us from doing good things, for trying to make things better around it for their own sake, not for this purpose or this outcome or this meaning at the end. And that's kind of what I take from absurdism. And I find it actually provides a nice, I guess, boundary or sort of anchor point in my own perspective.
That is an absurdly profound reflection.
Huh.
Have you seen the movie Lions for Lambs?
No. Actually, is that the Tom Cruise one?
Yes.
Yeah, Robert Redford. Yeah,
Yes.
I have, absolutely. And I really like it. Yes.
Yeah, there was a scene in the movie where the professor was trying to, basically have a chat with
dissuade
this
the kids.
disengaged. Yeah.
Yep.
The professor said, Rome is burning, son, and the problem is not with the people that started this. They're past irredeemable. The problem is with us, all of us who do nothing, who just fiddle, who try to maneuver around the edges of the flame. And the student said, you think it's better to have tried and failed than failing to try, right? But what's the difference if you end up in the same place? To which he said, at least you did something.
That's really, really profound and a beautiful. That sort of reconciliation between, absurdism to me doesn't mean you give up, and that idea that this may be beyond reproach and there's things beyond our control and all that sort of stuff. But that still doesn't mean that we can't find value in our own lives in the pursuit of things that we believe to be good, and we still want to encourage it. It's by no means an anarchist sort of view where we just give up and do whatever we want. We still have that consideration for other people and looking to make things better, but we don't make our lives and our happiness contingent on being able to actually achieve that, or sort of the belief that this is the only sort of purposeful way in life. Yeah, that's actually a really, I've not thought of that link, but I do very much, and the older I get, and particularly in my role within the University of New South Wales, I do reflect on that Robert Redford character in that movie, who, probably shared a similar background to me. I think he was a Vietnam veteran in that movie,
Yes, yeah.
and tries to use those reflections to help other people in his academic role, and there are certainly parallels there.
Yeah. So totally agree with your highlight of absurdism. And I just like to highlight the sometimes unknown repercussions of our actions. We don't always have the privilege of understanding the ripple effects of what we perceive to be our telos, right? So I was looking into a few case studies. The first one was Pashtana Durrani, I think. She founded Learn Afghanistan, a digital school network offering school-age girls free online courses in STEM subjects during the 2 decades that the US Allied Forces were there. The second one was Matiola Wesa, who is a founder of Pen Path, who campaigns for girls' education, especially in rural and conflict-affected areas. And if you look into his profile, he had this moving library that he takes across different areas of Afghanistan. So just because it looked like it was a meaningless endeavor doesn't necessarily mean it didn't have any meanings.
Yeah, absolutely, and I certainly don't mean by those observations to trivialize, what may have come out of it, and the effort and that sort of stuff. And it does highlight this point that we do talk about actually at the start of Resilience Shield, this idea of complexity, that it is not binary and black and white, and it's not like saying that was all good or all bad, or nothing happened or everything happened. Clearly life doesn't work like that, and there are all those sorts of offshoots there. Yeah, so no, you're absolutely right there, and there's no way, nor should we even try to sort of, I guess, determine what might have happened if we didn't do this or we did do that, or whatever. We can't, and that is a trap that we often fall into, that sort of rumination about, oh, if only I'd done this, or if only that hadn't happened, or if only that decision hadn't been made. I mean, ultimately, none of us can change that, and so a lot of what we see, both from a resilience and a happiness perspective, is looking at, well, okay, let's focus on where we can go from here, and in many ways, let's deliberately focus on those positive aspects. And the two you've just highlighted, I think, are definitely positive aspects of that whole situation.
Yeah, I think if we could find just one case of the whole impact of what, the 2 decades of the US Allied Forces did was, I remember seeing the news just before they left the country. Did you see the parents handing over their kids and their babies to
Yeah.
soldiers manning the wall? I mean, if that summarizes the whole impact and meaning of what you guys did there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, let's talk about faith.
Yeah.
Would you mind sharing with us your journey as to where your faith is and how it
Sure.
translates to the way you parent your children as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, are you talking specifically about religious faith in this respect? Yeah.
Correct.
So I grew up as an Anglican, and not sort of strongly practicing. In fact, I caught up with my mum a couple of weekends ago. She lives on the other side of the country now, but we managed to catch up a couple of weekends ago, and I reminded her of the fact that I went to boarding school for years 8 and 9, and despite the fact that we at best would go to church once a year on Christmas, she managed to tick the box that said I was a weekly churchgoer. So for 2 years, I went to Anglican church every week. So I was baptized and confirmed through that. And then I think I sort of I use this line in the book that somewhere between sort of Bagram and Baghdad, I lost my religion as a way of sort of saying that I personally would now identify as an atheist. I don't have a strong religious faith, and I certainly have seen some of the manifestations of organized religion and the perversion of what I think is the core message of all the world's major religions, which I fundamentally agree with. You know, the kind of Ten Commandments-y style way of living your life, which is echoed throughout the world's major religions, is a good philosophy. But you know, the perversion of religion as power that we seem to see as a driver for a lot of conflict and a lot of negative aspects, I find a little bit disillusioning in that sense. And so I personally don't have this strong, organized religious faith. Now, having said that, my father was pretty much the same, but as I described, and I was just talking about this the other day, he was one of the most Christian people that I knew, in a sense of, you know, doing unto others, respecting other people, loving thy neighbor, helping people out. You know, I mentioned that thing, that silly little throwaway, which always sticks with me, but about, you know, never stopping to help someone on the side of the road, you know, and that to me is a very Christian thing to do. He would, you know, always do stuff like pick up rubbish if he saw it in an open space, you know, just these sort of small acts that were for something bigger than himself or for someone else. I always saw that as, I guess, a manifestation of a faith, of a belief in humankind, and really, if you like, of kind of a good life as might be codified in a religious text. So, you know, I do believe I was brought up, even though there wasn't a strong sort of theological underpinning for that, but there was really strong role modeling of behaviors that I think were ultimately faith-based. This idea that, you know, there was something bigger than yourself, that there was this kind of fraternity and this relationship between all humans, and that ultimately, you know, that golden rule, do unto others kind of mentality, even though it wasn't codified in a kind of religious sense, I think it was very strong in the way I was brought up, and certainly is something that I try to instill in my kids, that, you know, there are so many different perspectives, and I do believe that there are very few people out there who are deliberately trying to just be nasty, evil, awful people. That, you know, this understanding and this empathy, not only for how good we have it, but for different perspectives and different ways that people might be dealing with the situations they're facing, is really critical to being a good human.
How do you explain the meaning of life then to your kids? Or is it meaningless?
Yeah, well, I actually think it's meaningless, and it's but I don't see that as a bad thing. You know, I see that gives us this opportunity to basically work out what we think is good and virtuous behavior, and to pursue that. So I think the absence of an overarching meaning, and, you know, Camus himself talks about, you know, there's three ways that you can approach this recognition of the absurd. You know, if you realize, or you come to the conclusion that life is meaningless, there's three things you can do. The first one is suicide. You can just decide, okay, that's it, so no point, I'll end it. The second one is, interestingly, what he calls philosophical suicide. And this is basically saying that you replace this lack of meaning in life with a belief in something that he describes as irrational. And he's having a go here at religious dogma, this idea that, okay, this life is meaningless, but if we do a good job in this life, we'll have you know, heaven in the afterlife. I'm not taking a shot at that. I don't share probably the same level of criticism that he does in that thought. But his view is that if you are outsourcing this kind of concept of meaning to something that can't be rationally proven, then you are essentially committing philosophical suicide. You are subscribing to something that can't be rationally or logically proven, and that didn't reconcile with him. And so he wasn't able to find that sort of I guess meaning in a faith or a hope-based context, like a lot of people with religious faith do. His third view, and the one that I like and subscribe to, is this idea of revolt. You know, that you choose to enjoy life and to seek to do good things, even though ultimately it may be meaningless, that it may not contribute to bloody world peace or a happy ever after or result in ascension to heaven or any of that sort of stuff. You do it for its own sake, because it is a good thing to do. And so I kind of like that approach. We have some really interesting discussions. My kids are both at a Catholic school. We fully declared our atheism as part of that process. But they're doing religious education, and I think it's wonderful. They're getting exposure to what I see as a really important understanding that big parts of the world are have this religious faith, and also the thing we find delightful is that the Catholicism in the school manifests very strongly as just good pastoral care, being a good human rather than an exclusively sort of Bible-based interpretation. And there's nothing bad in that. I'm not anti-religion, but I certainly, from my perspective, I don't sort of associate with it in that sense. I don't have that strong religious faith, but I'm all about a lot of the positive messages in, like I said, most of the world's major religions.
Yeah, I like that Mark Twain quote, having faith is believing in something you just know ain't true. And as someone who grew up in a Catholic environment, I think it's a good thing to be able to take a step back outside of that framework and see, what else is on offer. And I do like the fact that the third option of revolting against the meaninglessness of the world gives you almost like a blank slate. And I'm assuming you would enjoy this as an artist. You can do whatever you want with it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great philosophy to pass on to the kids.
Yeah. And to me, and for whatever framework I make sense of the world, that ultimately is choosing to do things that I think are good and virtuous. And this echoes through a lot of the philosophies, religious or secular, that, that provides, I think, a good purpose, and provide, like, doing things that are bigger than yourself, and not just having that selfish, hedonistic, all about me sort of viewpoint. I personally think contributes to a much broader and richer sort of definition of happiness in my own life, even though that may not be framed in a religious dogma.
Awesome. So you spent 24 years in the army. You are managing your consulting firm. You have written a book. You are publishing another book. You're also a dad, husband, an athlete, and everything else. What's life for you like right now?
It's actually really good. Like I feel so lucky in so many ways. And I guess I use that term cautiously. I do feel proud and I guess happy that I've worked towards some of these goals, but there is a lot of just circumstance and serendipity that has led to where I'm at. We spoke in the Resilience Shield about this Japanese concept called ikigai, which is this beautiful kind of sweet spot, this intersection between, the things you love doing, the things you're good at, the thing the world needs, and the things you can get paid for. And it's often, I put these sort of circles, which probably doesn't translate very well into the audio environment, but it's often depicted as a Venn diagram, and this sweet spot where they all overlap is called ikigai. I am pretty close to that in terms of what I get to do for a living. I get to hang out with my awesome mate Tim as part of my work, and I really love the people I work with. I love the stuff we do. We certainly get paid for it. I think I've got a level of competence in it, although it's constantly a work in progress, and I hope it's something that helps people that the world may need. So it's ticking all these boxes, and so I feel very fortunate for that respect. I do recognise, one of the sort of downsides to it is I'm spending a lot of time away with work, and I recognise that that's an area that is detracting from the time I get to spend with my kids, which is obviously fleeting in the grand scheme of things, and I want to maximise that. So it's by no means this perfect sort of thing. There are compromises and trade-offs in anyone's life. This is something I continue to work on and to trade off on. But yeah, in general, I feel so fortunate to be in this position where, you know, I have got a number of these really important aspects of my life being sort of ticked off.
How do you make it work then with all of the challenges and demands that your current life is asking of you,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to spending time with your kids, that window that is now fleeting? What
Yes.
one thing that has made it work for you?
Um, I think, well, certainly, I mean, we wrote that resilience book and I wrote that happiness book very selfishly as a way to try to sort of work these things out for ourselves. And having that deliberate reflection on these concepts like, well, what is going to make me happy? And I think for a lot of time, and certainly while I was in uniform, I don't reckon I'd actually thought about that. And I think if I was prompted to ask, you know, to really analyze, I reckon subconsciously I was thinking, well, what will make me happy is that next promotion, that next higher rank, that next status sort of thing. Um, it wasn't so much a money thing for me and still hasn't remained that. But I think a lot of us, we don't think about that actively, about what will make us happy. And we tend to get caught up in these ideas of status, progression, promotion, and money are probably the societal proxies for happiness that many of us subconsciously subscribe to. And so I feel very fortunate that I've had this deliberate thoughting function through the books as a means of really looking at, well, what is it that's going to make me happy? And kind of it's none of those things, the status, the promotion, the money, the profile, any of that sort of stuff. Um, you know, some of those are enablers, but the real things are finding activities that I enjoy doing and that can help other people, and then time with people I love. And even in that, there's trade-offs, as I just described. And so it is this constant balance trying to do that. I think the other thing that is really important for my own happiness and for how I make things work is to have these goals and to have those, you know, I use that term telos, which I lifted from Aristotle. In general, I think the Greeks and Aristotle spoke about telos as this kind of all overarching life purpose. I tend to use it as more about, you know, just little meaningful goals, you know, so you can have multiple of these things. And they might be something. I mean, for example, that book is a really important goal in a work sense, and maybe, you know, I might have a marathon coming up or something that will serve as a goal. And those goals, as I said before, they provide this kind of framework that I find gives real purpose and happiness in terms of my day-to-day activities. So it's no longer just reading an article I find interesting. It's reading an article I find interesting that's going to contribute to my ability to write this book, to achieve this goal, and to maybe help people through that. Likewise, it's no longer just getting up and going for a run to, you know, to keep fit. It's a step on the way to this goal. And the real kicker, which I'm more and more coming to recognition, is the goal itself doesn't matter. I hope people will enjoy this book. I hope they'll buy it. I hope it'll help people. But it kind of doesn't actually matter. Don't tell my publisher I said that. But, you know, like it's been such a really enjoyable process. I was actually quite sad when I submitted the first manuscript. It's in the editorial process now. We're bouncing back and forth. But it was kind of over. The really fun bit of having that framework was kind of over, and now I you know, hope to, and we'll probably need to find another meaningful goal.
Be
And
careful what you wish for. Exactly.
careful what you wish for. Yeah. Careful, or your dreams come true. And I think a
Yeah.
lot of people find that, right? You know, you think, oh, if I just get this a position or this promotion, or, you know, marry this person or whatever, that'll be it. And of course it's not, and nor should we want it to be it. We don't want to define our happiness by the achievement of that. It's the process. And yeah, that Adam Grant, I think, that's a beautiful way of framing it.
Yeah. And it goes back to that absurdism. In the end, it doesn't really matter whether if you've completed the book or the run or the triathlon or whatever. It
Mm,
doesn't really matter. It's just continuous pursuit of something, I guess, that again goes back
yeah.
to what you think is your telos and what makes you happy.
And there's a really cool, you know, my pop culture references are much more dated than yours because I'm much older. But the end of the first Raiders of the Lost Ark, the first Indiana Jones movie, he's gone through this enormous trial and tribulation and all of this life-changing stuff to get this Ark of the Covenant. And then the final scene of that movie is this thing just getting filed in some archive in some, I don't know, museum somewhere, never to see the light of day. Like, it is so meaningless, all this stuff and all this face-melting violence that's gone on before it. And but again, that whole point, it's not the achievement, it's not the destination, it's the journey, all those sort of cliches. But, there's validity in that.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so if you could give your younger self one advice as someone who's about to turn 50 soon, let's go back to that young Ben who is not feeling confident, who feels a little bit chubby around the edges, knowing all of the wealth of knowledge and experiences that you've gone through. What one advice would you give that young Ben?
It's a really interesting question. I think, the immediate thing that springs to mind would be care less about what other people think, and by extension, do not compare yourself so much with other people. I certainly think that would be sage advice. And certainly as I look at in this book on happiness, there's a lot of psychology about, just how hollow those sort of comparisons are and how detrimental it is. It's not a good tool in general to develop ourselves. So that is the advice I'd give. I do wonder a lot, though, whether that 20-year-old Ben, that younger Ben, would actually be in a position to accept that advice. So much of this stuff, hopefully, you can provide some of these ideas and you can instill vicarious learning for other people. But a lot of it, I think, does come as a function of learning the hard way. And I think we can accelerate that through, hopefully books like Resilient Shield and the upcoming one on happiness. But I think it is up to people to actually take that, do something with it and to learn it themselves. And I do, there's that wonderful old, I think it's a Zen saying that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. I think there is an element of being ready for that. So I'd give the younger Ben the advice, avoid comparison, don't care what other people think. Whether younger Ben would accept or be in a position to listen to that advice is probably a whole other question.
Awesome. All right. So the last time we had you on, we ended with a quick fire session. So I thought I'd honor that practice. Are you up for another quick fire round?
Yep.
Okay. We have 2 minutes to answer these questions. Are you ready?
Yep.
Ben Pronk, what's the worst advice you've ever received?
Keep going no matter what.
If you're a color, what would you be?
Orange.
What's your chill out song?
I'd have to say Getting Away with It by James.
Cool. If you have to watch one movie on repeat for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Probably Black Hawk Down.
And the last one, if your son was to pick up your upcoming book when he's 50, what is the one thing that you'd like him to take away from your book?
I would love for him to reflect on the fact that he doesn't need it, that he is already happy and that he already knows that stuff.
That's awesome. Well, Ben, thank you so much for spending your time with us. I'd really appreciate all of the knowledge and wisdom that you've shared, but also your friendship over the years. So thank you.
And yours, Jane. And might I say, I really enjoyed that conversation. Thank you for the effort you put into think about those questions. And I thought there was a really broad-ranging and quite a deep conversation, which I very much enjoyed.
Sounds good. See you next time.
See you later.
This episode of the Breadwinning Mums was produced by me, Jane Lim, and our theme music was produced by Sam McNally. We recorded this episode on the lens of dark people who have passed their parenting story for generations. We pay our respects to the elders past and present and thank them for caring for country. Connect with us through LinkedIn or Instagram at Breadwinning Mums. Until next time.